Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Panos Mumsis, and I'm the host for today's webinar. So we'll be discussing about the use of cash in today's operation. Today's webinar is part of the Transformative Agenda series, where we try to encourage best practices and really look into how efficiency and effectiveness can be increased across field operations. I'm delighted to see we have over 41 countries, colleagues from 41 countries who have joined today's conversation live. I want to say a particular welcome to colleagues from Asia, from Africa, from Middle East. I see quite a lot of corporations, including delighted to see including senior colleagues who are joining this discussion. I'd like to start first of all by sharing with you a couple of ground rules before we go into the topic and presenting the speakers for today. As you can see in front of you on the WebEx, the webinar screen that you see on your computer, on the top right-hand side, there are basically four boxes: participants, chat box, questions, and polling. I'd like to particularly highlight the fact that you have the questions box. And I would really like to encourage all colleagues in the field from the get-go to not hesitate to send questions back to me, back here, where I will then be taking over to our speaker. Today's webinar is going to run for about 90 minutes. And basically during the first 45 minutes of the webinar, I will be asking a couple of questions to each of our speakers. And during the second part of the second 45 minutes of the webinar, I will be taking your questions and directing them to our speakers to hear their views. This webinar is a very interactive mode. I also want to point out to the chat box. If you look on the top right-hand side of your screen, you will see there is a button that refers to the chat box. And I really want to encourage you all to not hesitate to talk, to share views, reactions, in between all of you participating. You can also send messages back to the speaker. You can choose to send to one speaker, or you can keep the discussion sharing with everybody else as we're going through. We will be downloading some documents as we go through, which you will also see them reflected in the box as we go through. I hope you can all hear me loud and clear. If not, I want to point out that this webinar is also downloaded on YouTube with a live stream, where the voice, the sound, can be a lot easier than listening through the internet if in your location where you're listening us you have a problem with the internet. I would like to encourage all the listeners to be on mute button at all times. If any of you is not on mute, this is obviously affecting the sound quality for all of us participating on this morning's discussion. So today's discussion is really going to be about the use of cash. The questions we are facing basically is cash is becoming really more and more significant in emergency operations. It appears to be the most sensible way to help people. It gives dignity to the people we're trying to help. It gives them the choice to be able to decide how to spend the money. It stimulates the economies, the market. It really gets people on their feet. It helps them also to go back to a normal life as much as possible within the crisis they are in the middle of. It also gets assistance to the people in a fast way, in a cost-effective way, cutting down middle people, making logistics much lighter, the transport cost is avoided, and they also put a lot more emphasis on the private sector. But the question is it really that simple? Are there any drawbacks? Are there any pitfalls? Are there any problems? The objective of today's webinar, and really I'm asking all speakers as I will be presenting them and they will be sharing their reflections and views, is to be as practical as possible in the feedback. The point of this webinar is to give the tips, the advice, the field-based experience on the use of the cash to all listeners so that you can take it over to your operation. And I really hope that by the end of this webinar, you will come out with some more practical suggestions and ideas on what works, what doesn't work, and how to take it over to your operation. There are many angles, the role of the government, the local authorities, state or non-state actors in conflict situations, the structure, our own way, how we're working and how we're prepared to be able to support and to respond within today's complex situations and emergencies. So I'd like now to present the speakers one by one, and I'm delighted to say that we have 5 really distinguished speakers for today's webinar. We have Rosie Jackson, who is the technical advisor for CAL. She's joining us from Oxford in the UK. The next 3 speakers are actually in Nepal, and today's webinar is going to focus primarily on the use of cash during the crisis of the aftermath of the earthquake in Nepal, and I'm delighted to present Jamie McGoldrick. Jamie is the Humanitarian Coordinator and Resident Coordinator in Nepal. I'm also in Nepal. We're also going to be joined by Rita Bekal, who is the Regional Head for the Humanitarian Response for the Danish Church Aid. Rita will also be presenting in her capacity representing the NGOs in Nepal and highlighting the role they have done on the use of cash during the crisis. I'm also delighted to present Peter Margici, who is the Regional Director for South Asia for Health Age International, and also we're delighted to hear Peter's perspective from the Nepal experience. And lastly, we're going to have with us and want to present Tim Wade. Tim is the Senior Livelihood and Disaster Resilience Advisor. He's working with the UK government. He's DFID, and he's joining us live from London for this discussion. So a warm welcome to all speakers in today's conversation. And I'd like actually to start, go first to Rosie. Rosie Jackson was CAL in joining us from Oxford. Rosie, first of all, tell us what is CAL really? I mean, it's this organization that has been set up, so if you could really highlight in 2 words on CAL and the role of CAL. And then I would also want to, it would be great if you can give us some highlights and what are the options and what are the modalities when we talk about cash. So Rosie, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Panos. So I'll just start by running a bit through the Cash Learning Partnership. So we're a global partnership of humanitarian actors. We have around 5,000 individuals from 150 organisations that are active members in our community of practice. They're members of the D Group, receiving information and contributing to the work that we do. We work in policy and practice and research for over a decade now, looking at really action-based research, at capacity building, and coordination and facilitation around cash transfers. So we are 25 people. We have offices in Bangkok for the Asia region, in Nairobi for East and Southern Africa, and in Dakar for the West Africa region. And recently we've just now appointing a team in Washington for North America. So through that, we tried to get as much outreach as possible. So great, and thank you very much. I've been given the privilege of laying the foundations for the discussion today. I'm going to start by running through some of the basics of cash transfer programming, including some of the terminology and some of the definitions that we often see. I'll go on to look briefly at the things that should be understood when considering cash assistance as a component of the response, and conclude with some of the implications for our work moving forward. So as we've heard there outlined by Panos, and I'm sure you know, there's been a rapid increase in the use of cash transfers, in the volume of cash that's being distributed, as well as the number and diversity of contexts in which it's being used. Experience and collaborative research, evidence collection over this period has combined with opportunities to get it right through technology and improved communication, and these have driven a positive change in the policy environment for cash transfers. Increasingly, we're seeing the use of cash across different sectors and in joint approaches by multiple agencies. So what is cash? A simple question. There's a definition on the screen now that's from the Sphere Standards in 2011, and it reads, cash and voucher transfers are used to meet basic food and non-food needs, or to purchase assets enabling people to resume economic activity. So cash can be used as a tool to ensure access to goods or services in local markets. Simply put, if it's possible to buy a good or service in the adequate quantity and quality, then it's possible to use cash, provided that targeted populations are able to access markets safely. So typically, when part of a well-designed programme, cash assistance can offer choice and flexibility to affected populations in a manner in which decisions are respected and dignity is reinforced, so some of the things that we were alluding to. So the next slide, we're looking at some of this terminology I was referring to. So cash assistance encompasses cash and voucher programs, as you can see at the top there. Cash transfers would typically offer a broader choice than vouchers to recipient households because they're more fungible and more flexible, whereas vouchers tend to be more restrictive in their nature and may typically be recommended when a specific desired outcome is deemed critical, or, for example, where markets may need to understand their specific demand, as is the case in market recovery post-earthquake, for example, or where a context demands a system in which spend is more easily traced. The CALP advocates for the use of unrestricted and unconditional cash transfers where possible, and we'll come on to look at some of the things you need to consider for determining when this is appropriate and feasible. So here, these other two tiers that you can see in the diagram start to consider the nuances in cash transfer program design. The second tier considers conditionality or restrictions. This is these prerequisites or the utilization. So if a cash transfer is conditional, this refers to something that a recipient is required to do prior to receiving the cash transfer. And unconditional, obviously, is that this is not necessary. An example of a condition might be that households are required to send their children to school prior to being eligible, or that work is required through Cash for Work. So the utilisation discusses the way in which recipients are entitled to spend their cash. So unrestricted, for example, means that people are able to spend their money on any good or service they would like to prioritise. Sometimes this might also include savings and debt repayment, for example. A restricted grant or voucher may need to be spent on food or on specific nutritional foods like fresh food, for example, or on shelter materials. And so whilst these are both critical considerations in the design of your programme, it is worth noting that sometimes these definitions may differ, but the principle is the same. So the third layer here begins to look at some of the multi-sector developments in cash transfers over recent years. Many of you will have begun to hear about these in the context that you're working. Much of the policy and programming in these areas is in its early days of evidence collection, but the difference is typically in the intended purpose of the grant and the outcomes on which it will be monitored. Obviously, multi-sector programming entails a greater need of join-up along the programme cycle, which is both exciting and terrifying, I think we can all agree. So moving forward, what are some of the decisions you need to make and how can you make them? We get these questions, so can we do cash and should we do cash? So on the next slide, you can see some of the perceived pros and cons of considering cash transfer as a part of your response. So on the plus side, next to the green arrow there, you can see some of these issues. So this perceived that a pro is that adds security and accountability to donors. On the recipient side, there's an increased self-reliance and dignity, this issue of choice and shared decision-making, economic integration and inclusion, some of the things that were alluded to at the beginning of the presentation. But some of the risks and challenges are outlined also, some of which you can see actually directly contradict the pros. So you have exclusion risks here, where inclusion is seen as a positive, and accountability to donors versus the fraud or diversion. So when it comes to looking at some of these issues, you can see how you could start to unpack these and start to see the means by which you can capitalise on opportunities and risks. I think the inherent challenges of cash transfer are both in terms of those that it poses. So, for example, you have this perceived risk of conflict increased through cash being much more attractive. So that would be a challenge that is posed through cash transfers, but also those that it exposes. So when we talk about some of the issues and challenges that we face with cash, then we're talking about typically some of those weaknesses or challenges we know and understand well within our system that might apply to all of them, all of the modalities that we use, such as targeting and community participation and joint planning, for example. So in terms of making decisions on feasibility and appropriateness, much of this remains in the quality of your assessment and the analysis of vulnerability and needs. Cash may expose some of the weaknesses and assumptions we make in program design, simply because cash can be spent on anything. So if, for example, we don't give enough cash and our own assumed priority turns out not to be the priority of affected communities, then there is a risk that our outcome might not be realized. And this is where you can start to design your cash transfer program with complementary activities and complementary modalities. But critically, in your needs and vulnerability, understanding the ways in which people make their money, save their money, and spend their money is critical to understanding the expected impact of a program involving cash transfers in any sector. So on the next slide, you can see a program cycle of sorts. This will look similar to what you would expect. And this is because there's no additional steps per se within cash transfers. Rather, it's the systematic inclusion of information along the decision-making process. In addition to careful and accurate needs and vulnerability analysis that takes into account what we've just been discussing, program feasibility and monitoring for cash transfers includes an additional necessary emphasis on carefully understanding markets, financial service providers, technology, and issues of internal capacity to account for and deliver cash programming. So if we just take some of these new concepts, for example, take markets. So though this is as important for in-kind assistance, obviously, for cash, markets must be understood in terms of whether or not they're able to facilitate access to the right commodities or services at the right time, at the right price, and in the right quality and quantity. And then we need to come on to questions of, if this is not possible, what can we do to support them, and when will this be possible? For financial service providers or delivery agents in cash transfer programming, they must be able to deliver cash transfers in the necessary volume and at the necessary speed, and be able to provide adequate accounting for accountability purposes. And this is something that we need to learn to incorporate into some of the decision making. And then coming on to understanding technology and the platforms and opportunities that this presents to us. Critically, internal capacity is a consideration, and until organisations and institutions have the systems, processes and human resource capacity to deliver cash as a component, extra significance and effort should be given in this area. So it's not just humanitarian actors in the UN, in the Federation, NGOs who are engaged in the opportunities presenting themselves through cash. For example, national governments have long been capitalising on the ease of cash for meeting multiple objectives, and obviously this is not just in the humanitarian sphere. So to conclude on the rapid run-through, I think part of the reason that cash assistance is presenting a challenge to us in the sector is the point that it's not its own sector, it's not a new phenomenon as such, and it requires very many small changes to the approach that we use. That it's not rocket science is very positive, because it means we all have the capacity to understand and contribute to the positive development, but realising the critical challenges and opportunities it presents forms the foundation of what needs to be done. Understanding markets, delivery mechanisms and new technology, and new partnerships with non-traditional actors are all new components for us that require new discussions, new expertise and coordination. There's a lot to learn and a lot to change. The introduction of concepts of multi-purpose cash transfer lean on the necessary integration of approaches to analysing need and prioritisation and pose challenges for sector coordination, whilst the delivery of cash at scale involves necessary engagement of new actors and institutions with whom we're less familiar. So I think whilst the opportunities are clear for efficiency and effectiveness and the opportunity to modernise the sector, approaching the challenges and opportunities of cash assistance must involve a continued focus on preparedness, preparing ourselves by upskilling and capacity building, preparing our policy environment by continuing to research and build evidence, and focusing on preparing individual institutions for the delivery of cash, ensuring that all stakeholders are working towards a common goal. So this will involve ongoing developments in the shared systems and approaches, and improved collaboration with national government in emergency response, and increased cross-sector programme planning and coordination. Thank you, Panos.
Thank you, Rosie, for setting the scene, understanding the role of CALP, which is really very much focusing on the cash, but also listening your views on the modalities, the interventions, the different options, the multi-purpose, multi-sector, and so on, but also hearing your feedback on the pros and cons, what works, what doesn't, and what to be wary of is really hugely important, and then how to fit it in the humanitarian program cycle. I would even say also in the whole coordination and how we work together. We will come back more on this in a minute, but I was also particularly interested in what you said about the preparedness. Are we ready? Are we cash ready? Have we done our preparation, particularly in disaster-prone situations, or a contingency plan to make sure that we have thought in advance and set up whatever it takes to make sure that when a crisis hits, we are ready to roll out and respond. I'm actually going to take us all now to Kathmandu, and I'd like to bring online Jamie McCaudry, the humanitarian coordinator. He's also there with Rita Dakar and Peter McGeechy, two NGO organizations who work together with Jamie in this complex humanitarian response in Nepal following the earthquake. So, Jamie, I'd like to start with you. If I can ask, basically, how was cash used in the earthquake in Nepal, in the earthquake aftermath, in the humanitarian response? What was your role? What was the government role? What was the application of the preparedness that you have done in place? If we can hear your reflections and, more importantly, your practical advice to colleagues listening around the world, and I'm delighted to see that we have over 100 people online at this point. And I want to repeat what I said at the beginning to encourage colleagues to send questions as we go through. So, Jamie, over to you.
Okay, Panos, thanks a lot. First of all, maybe just to describe the background. When the earthquake struck, the government was in a situation of transition for 1.5 years. The earthquake that happened overwhelmed the existing systems here, the both bureaucratic and the preparedness systems. But I think the humanitarian community recognised very early on the need to use cash in a much more strategic way, and it featured in the flash appeal. There's been a long history of cash in this country because of even during the conflict and post-conflict era, and there's also a very serious social security system since the mid-90s. 30% plus of this country's GDP comes from overseas remittances from migrant workers, some 400,000 who leave each year for this country to work in the Gulf and elsewhere. And so they have systems of sending money back and cash being used here. There's been price and marketing monitoring going on for WFP for many years. However, the last 20 years of preparedness, there hasn't been the use of cash, and it's something we will look at. I think that you'll see on the screen here right now images of Nepal and of the earthquake response in Nepal, where both urban and rural communities were badly affected. And the response was through cash, but also the more traditional distribution commodities. And we used mobile technology where we could, and banking and remittance systems which were in place. And we also had to innovative ways of actually addressing some of the high remote areas where the most affected populations were, using mule trains and porters and Sherpas. And the different areas and the impacts demanded different approaches and a much great degree of flexibility as you wouldn't necessarily have in a normal emergency of this kind. We estimate around 10% of our response was based on cash, and we recognise the findings and the recommendations of the high-level panel report. And the questions we're asking ourselves now is how to scale up cash and how it can be ensured next time while we protect and preserve the logistical frameworks we have to deliver very much into those very isolated communities. There's some 150,000 people who live in the high remote areas which were affected by this earthquake who actually cannot even be reached in normal times by helicopter. We recognise cash as a modality in the strategic objectives of the Flash Appeal, especially as we move towards recovery and resilience. And we tried to put in place the emergency multi-purpose cash, and we use it identified as an effective and efficient modality of relief delivery. However, we didn't set any targets for the amount of people we wanted to try and reach by cash. This was partly to allow clusters themselves to ascertain where they wanted to work, the geographical areas, and the most appropriate form of assistance based on market functionality, access, and program objectives. In many of these areas which were affected by the earthquake, there were very little in the way of presence of the international community there. But at the same time, I think we could say that we've more than doubled the global average for cash transfers and humanitarian assistance, made up with 10% at the moment, and I think that's something we should be very proud of. Some over $25 million was delivered through more than 30 international NGOs and UN agencies. And, we know that 6% is a global average. $9 million of that was multi-sectoral and conditional cash grants. And some of it was, grants given to families for minimum expenditure baskets. At the same time, we gave $12 million in early recovery, food security and shelter, mix of cash, vouchers, cash for work, etc. And at the same time, we had UNICEF with top-ups. This is based on a pre-existing earthquake modality. They had social protection programs, and that was strengthened. The government themselves have obviously had social protection categories here in this country, 5 categories of vulnerable people, which some 450,000 people in 19 of the most affected districts had received this funding. For us, many organisations report that the people in the beneficiary list fall outside the existing social protection programmes. Therefore, to try and link those plans with the longer-term structures hasn't been that easy. And in addition to the $25 million delivered by the international community, the government themselves have estimated there's something $70 million to some 300,000 households. That's about half the population who are living in damaged properties or destroyed houses. And they received a 15,000 rupee shelter support. That covered also death compensation, food and medical support. And a 3-month Social Security Assistance Programme distribution was used over the period of the earthquake itself. As I mentioned earlier, there's a large amount of money comes from this country through remittances, and therefore they have systems in place. The technology is okay. There's been long-term social protection cash programs. But at the same time, I think the financial service providers face liquidity challenges, limited geographical coverage, and challenges in recovery from the earthquake itself. A lot of the damage was done to the banking sector too. The support infrastructure for cash transfer programming in Nepal is still evolving. And at the moment, there's only about 30% of people who actually have access to this type of ability. So, and at the same time, we've got to note the fact that in order to get a bank account here, get a mobile phone here, you have to have citizenship. And there's some 4 million people in this country who don't have the necessary papers to open a bank account and access to formal services. And right now, the overall access to financial services in Nepal is some 30% of the population. The UN Capital Development Fund has been collecting data on financial services and they shared that immediately with the NGOs, the UN partners, to try and get a sense of, the amount of limited agents who are actually working in the sector and how we could use those and make sure we were there. And at the same time, the banking sector was very responsive to the emergency and for the humanitarian community. Some NGOs in this response made agreements with banks to travel to remote areas for cash distribution, even beyond the usual remit. We had an organisation called Hello Paisa, which is a company that offered mobile financial services linked with banks. And through these agreements with NGOs, some banks have even been able to deliver areas outside the established networks, much closer to the beneficiaries. A lot of money was put as cash in envelopes, and this was delivered to very remote areas where there wasn't the possibility of using the technology. This has to be done by helicopter and other means, and we don't know yet the details of that, but we've got quite a sizable number. Some of these areas no functional financial services providers, and the NGO then had to contract retailers to distribute the money, and others have used the local cooperative system which is in place. In terms of coordination oversight with the government, OCHA set up a cash coordination group, and that was based out of the capital, Kathmandu, but more importantly linked to the 3 humanitarian hubs close to the affected populations. They developed multi-purpose grant operational guidelines, and these guidelines were spread around and shared with as many people as possible. There was some difficulty between the balance of national direction on cash and local decision making at district level, and that was problematic. So right now we are questioning to what extent the cash coordination group managed to influence clusters, and maybe this is a lesson for the future, in terms of focus and mandate of the group and the coordinators. The high-level panel recommends that cash transfers could be broken down, break down some of the more counterproductive divisions between clusters, and I think that's something we have to consider. We do not think we saw evidence of this happening in Nepal. Instead, the cash coordination group and its members operated more as a sectoral type of operation, and I think there are implications there we have to consider. The cash transfer, I think, programme has not been adequately captured throughout the response. We haven't done the information collection. We're doing duplication, the multi-sectoral grants, the cluster 4W systems. We haven't been able to do this. We have to set up a system different for the next time. In terms of targeting, this is not an issue specific to cash, but it's also something we were struggled with. The government targeting this tend to perceive cash as compensation for losses, whereas we in the humanitarian world see it as accordance with needs. The local authorities have pushed this idea of blanket coverage of assistance, sometimes thinking blanket coverage would be easier to programme, but at the same time because of political pressures, and has made it difficult for us to correctly target beneficiaries, particularly in this recovery phase. In terms of monitoring, we're post-monitoring the distribution and unconditional assistance has been spent on shelter, labour for shelter and food for the most part. When we're asked about additional cash received, beneficiaries don't actually include the remittances they receive from overseas. They see that as normal income and not related to the earthquake. So it's quite difficult then to understand the volume of cash available for some households and then their address the levels of vulnerability. Information on cash from the government was quite confusing, and it was disseminated from national level and was then interpreted locally, and sometimes it wasn't always quite consistent on that. And just to close then, the future for us is that all the emergency preparedness support is challenging within the Nepal political context. There's been no local elections in this situation here for 16 years. The local government authority was overwhelmed by the emergency itself, and we tried to put cash in place, something that actually maybe slightly confused because we hadn't done the prep work on this. I think that as a strategy for targeting criteria, we need to look at the harmonized grant system decided at a national level to ensure some sort of equity across the actual country itself. And the harmonization of cash grants and conditionality doesn't need to imply that everybody receives the same, but the cash grants are pre-agreed and classified along principles. We're also trying to put together a baseline map which looks at where we have the markets, the tertiary roads, where we have the financial providers, and at the same time identify areas where populations can be supported through cash. And these populations, be it in terms of high or low cost markets, is what we're trying to do. This is underway right now, as well as at the same time mechanisms of accountability and transparency will have to be scaled up in order for cash to be used more next time. And I think that we're going to try and see how we can use this in the future, learn lessons from what we've done in this, and as we look forward for the more preparedness work in the future, we hope that we can improve ways for cash to be used for preparedness. So I'll finish there, so thanks Panos.
Thanks, Jamie. Wow, a lot of information, a lot of work. 10% of assistance being used in cash in Nepal. I think this is higher than the worldwide average. Most probably a lot more can be done, should be done. You really, Jamie, you touched on a number of issues. We will come back to you after I also hear the other speakers. You already said that in a way we need to set up the system differently next time. We'll be interested to hear your feedback for that a little bit later on, but also interesting to hear about cash which operated as a coordinating sector. trying to look at multi-purpose and how to bring it all together within the system. So thank you very much, Jamie. I'm really interested to bring Rita Dekal on this conversation, who's also joining us from Kathmandu. Rita works with the Danish Church Aid. She's also representing the Association of International NGOs in Nepal, AINN. So Rita, what is the role of the NGOs in the Nepal humanitarian response in terms of cash assistance? If you could tell us your thoughts, please. Rita, over to you.
Hello. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Panos. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be talking today about how DCA cash for shelter worked out in post-Gorkha earthquake in April 2015. DCA has distributed $1.3 million US using mobile phones in 4 districts in western and central Nepal: Gorkha, Dhading, Lalitpur, and Bhaktapur, out of 14 severely affected districts. We started our cash distribution in one of the remotest and highly affected village development committee, which is the lowest unit of the government administrative division in Nepal. 5 weeks after the earthquake, to 148 households, reaching about 815 people on the very first day. DCA provided shelter support, as initial assessment findings showed that shelter was a pressing need at that time due to the high damage of shelter and houses and impending monsoon season. DCA completed market assessment through its local and Act Alliance partners in all 4 districts. The survey findings showed that market was functional with small quantities of goods for reconstruction available in the local market, and they were accessible. DCA decided to go for cash, as it was observed that many humanitarian actors were waiting for a large quantity of CGI sheets, corrugated galvanized iron sheets, to become available before conducting the distribution, while individual families were able to source small quantities of CGI sheets relatively quickly. So many households had already built and were reporting borrowing money to do so. People had a preference to receive cash over kind assistance. Providing cash gave freedom of choice to buy other shelter materials or to spend the money on labor cost. As one of our beneficiaries said himself, if it was CGI sheets instead of cash, I would have sold it immediately to someone, even in low price, to buy other needed things for my family, as I had managed CGI sheets already. Rambadu Tamang from Salang VDC in Dhading district said. We decided to use mobile phone-based cash transfer, having already tried it successfully in response to fire disaster in eastern Nepal in early 2015, the first time this had been used in Nepal. This system provides transparency and security. Remote and real-time monitoring was possible to senior managers, among others. We also wish to involve private sector, banks, and financial service provider, Hello Paisa, in this case, in humanitarian action, and build relation for future private-public partnership for longer-term programming as well. It was an efficient way of doing cash, as we distributed to as high as 1,476 households that benefited more than 8,000 people per day once we learned efficiency over the time. To ensure community members had enough information to make good purchasing decisions about shelter materials, quality CGI sheets, for example, we provided information alongside the government. We also provided a list of reliable vendors. The long-term presence of our local implementing partner in communities help us to get access to the affected areas quickly and rapidly build trust and scale up operation. This helps us to make agreements with local authority to operate in the area. We were able to access government beneficiary data and compare with our own. We also mobilized 80 government officials from 9 village development committees and 4 municipalities to support the cash distribution work. Beneficiaries were selected based on the government list of earthquake-affected households. People were informed by the social mobilizers, community volunteers, and village political mechanisms about where and when to get the assistance. The recent post-distribution monitoring showed most people walked about an hour from their home to reach the cash distribution point, and there were multiple distribution sites established in one VDC. The PDM also showed 92% people used cash on shelter construction and associated labor costs, supporting DCA's decision to provide cash for shelter. In normal days, many men go abroad for work and women become the head of the household in these VDCs. However, after the earthquake, few men return home to be with family in difficult times. Because of the need of the government, need to use the government beneficiary list, it was a challenge for us to target specifically women for this assistance at that time. However, because of the high rate of men working abroad, 29% cash went to the women's hand, whereas 71% went to men. Local political interest, targeting, and lack of proper understanding of large-scale cash transfer in emergency at various levels were among the challenges faced in the initial days. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rita. And really impressive to see the work you and other organizations did together. You highlighted a number of challenges and the way you went about delivering using the mobile phone, using the local government officials, the network that you put in place, but also the challenge on how to ensure that women are in equal manner also receiving cash to use in this crisis situation. I'd like to bring to this conversation Peter Magici, who's with Health International. You are the regional director, Peter. I'd like to ask you, I understand that Health Aid International was one of the first organizations to respond in the Nepal crisis, actually within 2 weeks of the earthquake, before any coordination was set up or before many other actors were actually on the ground. You were one of the first to start making use of cash to help people in ensuring food delivery and assistance to cover their needs. So can you tell us a little bit how you went about it? Obviously, you must have prepared in advance to be ready within days to start implementing as the operation. So Peter, over to you.
Thanks, Panos, and hi, everybody. As our name suggests, Health Aid International focuses on the needs of older people and senior citizens. But just to take up your last point, Panos, and it might be a surprise to listeners to know this, but we hadn't made any preparation before the earthquake to do cash, in fact, or anything else for that matter, because we're a relatively new organisation in Nepal, and neither ourselves nor our local partners are particularly expert on humanitarian response. So maybe our story can kind of illustrate exactly what is possible to do in a hurry if you have a little bit of expertise, you get some help, you ask for help if you don't know what you're doing, and you have the right kind of attitude and approach. As you said, we were able to get our first unconditional cash distribution out to beneficiaries on the 8th of May, which I think was 13 days after the earthquake on the 25th. And that including us doing some working with our partners, doing some assessments, getting beneficiary lists together and validated, getting the funds available and getting it out to the field and then distributed. So I think we're very fortunate to be able to do that. We had good partners, local partners to work with, and I want to stress the work that they did. We got a huge amount of cooperation from the local government. So I think they are due a lot of credit as well. There was a real willingness, I think, everywhere after the disaster for everybody to move as quickly as possible to do what they could with the resources at their disposal. And it wouldn't have been possible without a huge amount of collaboration from many different people. So we got our first just over 2,000 cash transfers out on the 8th of May. We were giving a $75 Nepali rupee equivalent to older headed households where the house had been destroyed or damaged by the earthquake. And by the 5th of June, we had completed our cash transfers to just over 10,500 beneficiaries, and we distributed just below $800,000 in that period. I think what some of the learning we got out of this process was obviously we wanted to check that people could actually spend that money. So the points that have been made earlier about the importance of ensuring that local markets are functioning is a crucial one if we're going to use cash in these circumstances. We were basing our knowledge on secondary sources, particularly WFP, who had quickly done some market assessment. But we also managed to send a few of our own staff and partner staff out to the areas that we were going to be targeting to ensure that there were basic commodities on the market. And when we were secure in the knowledge that that was the case, then we could move ahead. We had kind of anticipated that our particular target group of older people would be looking to spend money on the immediate needs, to include things like medicine or healthcare, food, shelter material, etc. I think I'd just like to say as well that, you know, we talk a lot in emergencies about reaching the vulnerable groups, so sometimes older people are kind of overlooked a little bit. Around 650 older people, that's people over 60 years of age, were affected by this earthquake directly. But when we did a little bit of analysis of those that had unfortunately lost their lives in the earthquake, about 29% of the victims were actually older people. And compare that with the general population of older people in Nepal, which is only 8%. So it gives you an indication of the vulnerability of older people in disasters. I think we've heard quite a lot from the earlier speakers about kind of some of the technical challenges or technical principles behind cash distribution. I think one area that we found was also very important, as I'm sure others did, was what's the local kind of political economy, the local political dynamic that's going on. We can all work on having very well designed cash transfer programs, and we can find a way to deliver them, but if we don't have the understanding and the agreement of the local political authorities, and that can be in this case local government authority as well as local political party people on the ground, then you know that can make or break your work. So we were very fortunate, and we had a lot of good local partners who could kind of negotiate the space at the local level to ensure that the necessary approval and support was forthcoming from the local authorities. So that really didn't get in the way of the work. Secondly, we worked quite effectively with the private sector. We had started off about the first 30% of the distribution went in a cash, an envelope approach, because that was really the only way that was possible at the time. And then beyond the first 2 or 3 weeks, we managed to work locally with the bank, who have a very good network across the country based on all those remittances that we heard about that are coming from outside. So we were able to work with them, and they did a lot of bulk cash transfer to distribution points. That was a real help because it took all the kind of security worries away from us. We weren't taking a lot of cash with us from place to place, and of course there would be security problems with that. I think our post-distribution monitoring showed that most of the beneficiaries spent the money on those areas that we thought they would: food, shelter, health, medicine, and paying for labour. Just the last couple of points before I round up. I think you made a point, Panos, about the importance of preparation for cash transfer, indeed other response in emergencies. And I think if we have in future clearer principles about this, a clear agreed mechanisms for deciding, for example, on the amount of money that should be provided to different groups, we have the structures in place to act quickly, and we can fast track our response. I think that would certainly be a help and enable us all to move a lot more quickly than we did in the past. And again, just to reiterate, you do need a level of knowledge and expertise to do this, but if you have the right attitude and you know that something has to happen quickly, and you get out there and do it, hopefully without making too many blunders and mistakes on the way, you can certainly get this done quickly. And I think that's possibly one lesson that we learned, and I think that's one of the messages that we would like to send out to others from our own experience. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter. Your last words basically have the right attitude, go out and do it. And of course, that's I think have so many people joining this webinar wanting to see how to go out and apply to their own operation. At this point, we are 20 minutes past the hour. I'm going to be starting taking questions from callers. And actually, one of the questions that we have already received is on the topic that actually our last panelist wanted to talk about. And I'd like to bring to this conversation Tim Wade, who's the Senior Livelihood and Disaster Resilience Advisor with the UK government based at Griffith, London. Tim, one of our listeners sent a question and said, how about the donors? Are they really willing to take the risk to give money to be used for cash? Is it something that the donors we should be approaching, or are they really hesitant? And I also know that this is, you have also funded an important research and a multi-partner report that came out on the use of cash, which has been recently released and will be also downloading as part of this webinar. So Tim, would be very interesting to hear your views, not just as the UK government, but if you can also speak on behalf of the donors on the use of cash, and 2 words also on the report that you just released. So Tim, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Panos. And hello, everybody. This is London calling. I want to talk, yes, on behalf of DFID, and I can't talk on behalf of all donors. So I like the question. I think that from DFID's perspective, yes, we are on the front foot. We feel that the evidence is in place now. We've spent the last 3 years, I would say, collecting the evidence, and we know that cash is a preferred option by local populations. It puts people at the centre of a response, and it gives people choice. It cuts across sectors, and the reason we put the panel together was that we felt that the problems were more political, and I'm talking about political economy of the humanitarian system, of agencies, of NGOs. The institutions talk to mandates. Cash doesn't sit well in the cluster system. We need to bring in different actors, and we need to change the culture and the mindset. This is kind of where we're coming from. What HelpAge said is very, very true, that it isn't rocket science. You know, if we can pull food aid from a combine harvester in Nebraska in the States to a small village in Nepal or Ethiopia, we should be able to get cash to people. So how can the system better support cash, and how can we promote flexibility and accountability to beneficiaries? And how can we transform the system, if you like, to deliver this? The panel we put together was a different makeup of the normal actors, I would say. We wanted the voice of private sector, financial providers. We wanted the innovation technology people sitting at the table, but we also had the humanitarian people there, and also the voice of national government. The report is called Doing Cash Differently, because the feeling is we are doing cash. We're doing cash in a lot of places very, very well, very, very effectively. But how do we move from the sort of 6% that's going on at the moment to, we didn't put a target on this. I don't think the panel wanted to put a target on this, but we feel that there's the space for really radical scale up, 30, 40, 50%, but it depends on the context. So the recommendations of the panel, unsurprisingly, as it's a cash panel, is to do more cash, very much focused on multi-sector cash. And we are asking ourselves and other donors to say, why not cash? If not cash now, then when can you do cash? So to be on the front foot, to have cash sort of foremost, instead of at the moment in kind being foremost. Big story about cash and preparedness and contingency planning, which we have been hearing. Interesting again that HelpAge went out without preparedness, but I think you need to know who the local sector providers might be, whether you can use mobile phones. If not, maybe just plan to put it into an envelope and stick it to a tarpaulin. I think something which we feel is very important is to distinguish cash from vouchers. I understand the CALP definition of cash-based transfers is about cash and vouchers, but vouchers are completely different. Vouchers are more expensive, they take away from the beneficiary choice, and I think we need to say cash or payments or transfers versus vouchers versus in-kind. Cash won't always be the best. There will be situations when vouchers are more appropriate, but we need to be clear about that. I mean, my other work is very much around the resilience agenda, and I do feel that there's a big story around cash transfers which actually use and can build markets. There's a big economic multiplier story which I don't think is being told at the moment. A lot of the evidence of that comes from cash transfer systems within social protection programs. So how much could a social protection program be a first responder, be the only responder if it's in place and the people are in the right place? The other thing we feel is not being used enough is the private sector. I mean, we use private sector in our in-kind delivery. We do use private sector in our cash transfers, but we feel that it's not really the NGO or the UN sort of unique selling point of actually delivering the cash. We feel that this can be done through innovative technologies which are being run out, as we speak. And I would question how much we're plugged into that. So the Give Directly model, for example, of taking cash from a computer console in Europe down to a household telephone in Uganda or Kenya. I mean, these things are out there, and how do we scale them up? The other thing is that digital cash is shown to be a lot safer, a lot less prone to fraud than in-kind delivery and also cash in envelopes. So wherever possible, e-payments is the way to go. They're easily tracked, they're more secure, they give more privacy, they can't be seen. Coordination and alignment in the existing system, I think we have been talking to a lot. I won't go into that, but I think there's a big story there. And I think that our vision is to have large-scale, coherent, and have it competitive. So put it out to tender and try and get those economies of scale. At the moment, as we're doing cash, we're not really realizing the real efficiency and effectiveness benefits because we're doing it in a very fragmented way. So how could we have all the donors working on one platform? How could we have large NGO consortiums? How can we sort of pull resources into one place in order to do deliveries? And then I think the final one, which doesn't only relate to cash, is how to separate needs assessments from the delivery, and how to get targeting much more on a sort of basic needs basis, and also more around poverty and vulnerability than sort of do they need food, do they need shelter, do they need health. So unlocking that sort of multi-purpose, multi-sector elements of cash. I think finally I'd just like to say, I mean, talking to the donor question, I mean, from DFID's point of view, I mean, as I said, we feel the evidence is in place, and we're pushing out on this. We are actually, going to start asking the why not cash. We are going to be working with other donors. We are going to be trying to combine and align with other donors so that we are giving, to a certain extent, as much as we can as individual donors, one perspective, one voice. We are going to be trying to work with political leaders and sort of unlock that cultural attitude. We're going to be working a lot more with private sector and innovation companies to actually put that sort of investment into financial infrastructure. And of course, the big preparedness story. We feel that there is a need to, as we prepare for in-kind responses, for shelter responses, cash needs to be folded into this preparedness story, not standalone. It's another modality. It's not new. It's not different. And we're also going to be focusing very much on the market elements of response. And this isn't about market assessments. This is looking at how cash can actually build markets. If there are blocks in the market, how can we unblock those to allow cash to work? And looking at the broader ecosystem, so other donors, new actors, and obviously focus on better coordination and alignment within the sector. Okay, thank you very much, panels.
Thank you, Tim. Quite a lot. You covered really, again, several aspects of the use of cash, yes, from a district perspective, but clearly the message is that I can see also from the report, us Humanitarian, we're not doing enough. We should be doing a lot more use of cash. You also talked about the private sector, innovative ways of trying really to reach the people in the most direct, cost-effective way, but also the role of the donor coming together coming together and having also a clear message, both in terms of allocation, but also support for the direction the operations can take. Of course, given the context, the government, the political security, economic, that allows or hopefully enables the use of cash in terms of where we are. We have about half an hour left, and I have to say I'm inundated with so many questions that we have received from our listeners. And so what I would like to do in the next 30 minutes is direct the questions, and I would like to ask all the panelists to be as brief as possible so we can really take as many questions as we can in the remaining time that we have. And I'd like to go first to Jamie. And we have received a question from Jude from Oxfam. We're willing to say, clearly we're not set up to deal with a multi-purpose cash approach in terms of the coordination, but also in terms of the systems that we're working, humanitarian and donors as well. So Jamie also talked about the need to be set up in a different way next time round. So can you share your advice to colleagues listening who are thinking of setting up, if they haven't already done, a cash coordination or a cash response in their operation? So it'll be interesting to hear your reflections and lessons learned having gone through the system in the Nepal. So Jamie, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Panos. And I think obviously it's early days here in the earthquake, and what we had was, in order to try and embed the cash coordination and the use of cash across the key sectors, was something we were very conscious of. And thankfully, OCHA stepped in and set this up for us. And we tried to use the best experiences we had, use the local conditions, the local technology, and the local limitations, and find a way of us going forward. However, I think that's something we're doing here locally. Whether we can then consolidate that and come up with something which is different, or whether the current setup of the humanitarian architecture actually allows itself to be best used for donor coordination, using cash, response coordination, using cash. And I think maybe we have to think in terms of, as we move obviously towards the World Humanitarian Summit, there's going to be a lot of thinking on the way the architecture is set up. But should we be thinking in terms of reflecting on, does the clusters, as I mentioned in mine, are they counterproductive in terms of use of cash? Should we come up with some new coordination mechanisms that looks at public and private on these issues? Should we re-engineer some of these things? Do we look at sort of some way of having umbrella funding or some sort of consortia? I mean, I think that for us it's very early days, as I mentioned, so we don't really have a formula which would work beyond our current context, and we're just trying to expand what we have on the ground. So I don't have a definitive version of how it should go forward, but I think there's a lot of questions on how we operate as a system and how those systems can use cash differently and better. Over to you.
Thanks, Jamie. I'd like to go to Rosie. And Rosie, we received a question from James, who has said, what single humanitarian decision-making architecture and funding mechanism will provide the coherence needed for efficient humanitarian action? So the question is really about the single humanitarian decision-making architecture and the funding mechanism. Rosie, what are your thoughts?
Sorry, Panos, would you mind repeating that? Sorry.
Yeah, Rosie, the question is, what single humanitarian decision-making architecture, so we're talking about the architecture in the delivery of humanitarian systems, and also architecture in terms of funding mechanism, how would the donors, how would it go, will really give the use of cash a push to make it efficient and effective, so both in terms of coordination and the donor side.
Great. Okay, thank you. I thought that's what the question was. Obviously, that's a very difficult question. I think it's something that we have been giving some thought on, but from the CALP side, we're just trying to support as many different angles in terms of ensuring that development continues throughout. There's a lot of reference, and Tim had just referenced the one platform, this idea of having sort of joint assessment, one agency that would look at an assessment and then looking at different responsibilities for the delivery of that. I think one of the things that we're just very conscious of through that process is just ensuring that we also foster the diversity which really adds value within the system. Certainly something that is going to be able to streamline some of the decision making is this increased focus on trying to come up with multi-purpose cash programming, and we heard about that and a call out from Nepal where it was about let's try and establish prior to emergencies as part of our preparedness, what sort of needs are we trying to meet through one cash transfer. So I think in terms of that's something that we can play a role in terms of preparedness. That's about understanding needs and the way that cash can contribute to that, but also trying to ahead of time address some of the immediate concerns around partnering and finding efficiencies with the private sector, but also trying to look at means by which you could have a sort of multi-modality response. So I think for us, one of the things that will help is to really start to unpick some of these bigger questions, which just need to have a bit of concentration on them, and then funding mechanisms that are realistically enabled very early on and at different contexts.
Right, thank you. I'd like actually to go now to Rita. And Rita, we have received a very interesting question about protection of the people we're trying to help. And Sabine was sent a question saying, have any of the panelists seen any impact of cash transfers in addressing protection issues, in trying to better help the protection issues where the cash has helped to bring better protection to the person that is vulnerable and we're trying to help? So, Rita, I'm interested to hear your views and experience from the past. Over to you.
Thank you, Panos. In fact, you know, this time, even after the large earthquake in Nepal, you know, security-wise, we were fine. There was not a big issues in the field, especially because these were the remote villages, and normally when it comes to the hilly Nepali villages, the protection, security is not is not a big issue. However, about the protection of the elderly people, protection of the vulnerable people while coming to the distribution center, going back to home, and all those were normally considered by the NGOs while distributing the cash. What we did for example, in our case is you can see from the background photographs as well that, you know, we had oriented our partners and staff in the ground, like including the volunteers, that, you know, we need to be careful about protecting the people who come from their home to the distribution point. Therefore, as I already mentioned in my presentation, that, you know, we were able to establish the distribution point in the village, and we were able to bring the bank along with us. So it was maximum 1 hour distance that people were traveling to the distribution point. So that was one thing that we were careful to see that issue, and we make sure that people don't have to travel all day, because these villages are very remote. So that was one. And another issue that we consider is our volunteers and staff were mobilized to help these people when they come to the distribution point. They always came with one of the assistants with them, their family members or spouse or anyone, for the elderly people and for the pregnant and lactating mothers. So that thing was considered. And also we were able to look at the other aspect. We did not wanted any security force coming around us to help. However, there are each area after the Mao's intervention in Nepal, we have police station in many areas. So police and security personnel were around us, even if we did not invite them. It was their interest to be around because we were working with cash. So these things was there. However, for the community protection, making sure that people have no more problem coming to collect the cash, we were able to take care of that, including we had a station for the psychosocial care, because these people were under the pain after the disaster. So we made sure that we have a psychosocial desk in each distribution point. And after they get the cash, our psychosocial officers and psychosocial volunteers were helping them if they have any other issues and they want our other help. So this cash transfer program also brought us so close to the people that we were able to follow on their cases. Thank you. Over to you, Panos.
Thank you. Thanks, Rita. Interesting to see the depth and the steps you took to indeed be closer to the people in terms of the response. I'd like to ask all of you really to remain on mute. I think there is one colleague who is possibly typing in between that is really, we can all hear it. So if you could please all make sure you are on mute. I'd like to move to the next question, and Peter, I'd like to direct it to you. We have a listener who is sending a challenging question. So Cyril, who sent the question, is saying, low market functionality provides really a limited potential for cash in Nepal in particular. Donors also need to understand the market when they tell us do more cash. So Cyril is saying, is it too simplistic to simply say more cash? Peter, we're interested to hear your experience working with your NGO in Nepal and how the low market functionality and the particular context. So does this cash fit to all situations? Can we just overgeneralize and say simply not cash? We're interested to hear your reactions, Peter. Over to you.
Thanks, Panos. Yeah, I think it would clearly be a mistake to just assume that cash was the way that we can solve these challenges. Clearly, it's very much linked to the availability of basic commodities on local markets. I think in the case of Nepal, to some extent, with local products that people would normally purchase very locally in the bazaar, in the local shop, that kind of availability of those goods actually recovered quite quickly. Fortunately, this was a big disaster, but it was not the catastrophe that we all had kind of feared would happen. So a lot of the basic infrastructure was still in place, and markets recovered quite quickly. I think the challenge possibly came when collectively we're all talking about scaling up the response and how much commodities available on the local market, particularly of items that wouldn't normally be in huge demand in the general, run of things. For example, shelter materials, whether that be tarpaulins or zinc sheets and things like that. Huge demand was created because of the earthquake and the damage it was done, particularly to housing. So huge amounts of those commodities had to be procured from outside the country and brought in. So yeah, the cash itself is not a solution. It has to be linked up with these other factors. I think that's where a lot of the preparation comes into play, and getting quick assessment of what the situation is on the ground and sharing that information so that the scale up is actually achievable within a reasonable time frame. Again, if there's too much money chasing too few goods, you might get into problems with high inflation and even some security issues. So yeah, you have to look at these things in a kind of linked up way to help you come up with a reasonable judgment and a decision of what's the best thing to do. But I think particularly on the scale up, that's when you can run into problems if the market isn't functioning and the commodities are not there in the bulk that is being required.
Panos, can I come in on this one, please?
Please, Tim, go ahead.
Okay, just to say this, I mean, I take the point about markets, but all in-kind distributions, vouchers, cash, all have market effects. And I think we have to be realistic about how much cash we do actually distribute in humanitarian responses. I mean, Jamie said it, in Nepal, 30% of the GDP is remittances, and that's as cash. The amount of cash that we were distributing in Nepal and in any other context is really targeted small amounts to 10% of households maximum, I would say. So there is very little evidence that cash distributions in humanitarian creates inflation, but obviously there has to be market functionality. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Indeed, I think what I can hear you saying is we need to look at the number of variables in your operation in this context where you're operating to see what's possible and what's doable. But Tim, your message is pretty much an encouraging one to make it fit, provided for the minimum market in place. I'd like actually to take the next question and go to Jamie in Kathmandu. And Jamie, one of the listeners has sent also a provocative question, saying the United Nations and the UN mandate are not well set up to deal with multi-purpose cash. It's actually something new that came in the horizon that wasn't really set up when these mandates and agencies were created several decades ago. So the question is, how as humanitarian practitioners, how can we change the mindset to bring the NGOs and the UN agencies out of the strict mandate mindset, which is sometimes hampering these new approaches to try and apply it in place? Jamie, over to you.
Okay,
Jamie,
sorry.
please,
Yeah,
unmute
I can hear you. Yeah, Panos, thanks. Yeah, interesting question. I think it's not just for cash only, that issue, but I would say that the international humanitarian system, which has been reforming itself since way back in the humanitarian reform days of the mid-2000s, I think have recognised there are some issues that have to be addressed. I mean, I think it's not just the humanitarian agencies, the NGOs and the UN agencies and the mandates. I think it's also donors and member states who are also part of executive boards, and they want to protect interests and mandates as UN agencies do as well. So I think if we're going to look at this issue of having cash as being a new methodology, a new modality to improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of relief as it shows to be, then we have to get a commitment from all those parties. And I think the difficulty will be, as we see in many situations, the UN family has this notion of delivering as one. That in itself is a very difficult thing to pull together because of mandates which are quite clear and delineated, although there is encroachment between some agencies and the mandates. It's very difficult to break that down because of those interests, very difficult to break down because of the protection of those interests, and not just from the UN agencies themselves, but also from the member states who are very much on the executive board or who have funding for their regular or their favourite UN agencies.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I'm actually going to take the next question to Rosie. And Rosie, we actually have received from 3 different listeners questions related to cash and security, the safety of humanitarian workers carrying cash and delivering it, in particular in insecure areas. There's reference, one of them talks about convoy attacks that have been taken when they've known that cash is there. So the question is, how can we deliver cash and ensure the safety of the humanitarian workers and the people that we're trying to help? So from your work and the number of NGOs who work with CALP, Rosie, what are your reflections in terms of safety, security, and the use of cash in humanitarian context, and particularly in highly risky areas? Rosie, over to you.
Great, thanks, Panos. I think it's a really interesting question, and one obviously that's been high up on the agenda. I mean, how can you ensure that cash can be distributed safely from, like you said, as humanitarian actors and delivery agents, but also on beneficiaries, for beneficiaries? Much of this, firstly, there is quite a lot of research and evidence around it, so it's worth looking into. I think this is where it becomes one of the issues that you can sort of mitigate these risks by designing your transfer mechanism. So often the sort of immediate security can be, humanitarian staff is about capacity to deliver that. This is where you can start to look at means by which you can deliver through mobile phones, for example, and different mechanisms and different means by which you can get very close to people affected. It's also something where you can start to look at this issue that Tim had raised and Nepal around remittances and how those are distributed. So, for example, in Somalia, the cash transfer programs have been using the Hawala system, which is something that is well established and enables cash to be transferred from a safe distance, and uses a system where recipients are, used to this and have means by which they can do it securely. It is something I think that has been raised more and more as we work in and around the Syria conflict, for example. How can we ensure that we can get cash in securely? But I think the message is really this is where it becomes about the operational design and ensuring that you have identified those risks and that you can do what you can to mitigate them. And ultimately, if it is something that you feel you're not able to mitigate, then this is where you might question the use of cash and move on to some of the other modalities, either in the short term or over time.
Thanks, Rosie. So again, use your common sense to judge in your own security, political environment, how safe, how wise is it to go ahead with the option. It's not to be applied to all situations. Obviously, you have to link it to your own situation to go on the ground. Tim, I'd like to come to you, and we have a question actually from one of the callers who, again, is challenging you, saying, can cash fuel conflict? And Jean-Sébastien is making a particular reference to Somalia and says that cash transfers have had a negative impact on the establishment of a separate taxation system in Somalia, which also has led into a fueling of the conflict on the ground. So, Tim, what are your reflections on this particular question?
Okay, yeah, thank you, Panos. I would ask the question back about what effects has food aid has on the conflict in Somalia and taxation in Somalia. I mean, I remember many, many years ago, used to listen to the World Service, and whole convoys of trucks were actually hijacked and disappeared into the bush. There has been cash transfer programs in Somalia, which has been electronic to mobile phones, and it's completely unseen. There have been examples where Al-Shabaab sit outside post offices and check people going in who are receiving transfers, but likewise at a food distribution point, you can have people in the bushes, sort of redistributing the food afterwards, as is the example in South Sudan. So much of this comes down to program design, and you need to sort of look at the potential modalities, look at the potential delivery mechanisms, be that food, be that vouchers, be that cash, and devise ways of doing that in the safest possible way. So I don't think that issue is peculiar to cash, and I would actually say that with cash transfers and electronic payments, there are probably very, very good ways of actually hiding the transfer so people don't see it. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Reassuring message, basically. This can happen with any other aid, not just with cash, of course. And again, to see how it fits within your own context. We have less than about 10 minutes or less left, so I'm going to be very quick on the question. And I'm going to go back to Kathmandu. And the question I have is about how does the social safety net programming linked with preparedness and humanitarian response. So I will put it to the Kathmandu team, and would be interested to hear who of the three wants to take the question about social safety net. So over to Kathmandu.
Yes, thanks, Panos. This is Jamie here. I'll take it, and maybe colleagues can add to it. I mean, the social safety net system here has been in existence for some time. It's very targeted to small groups, small vulnerable groups. The other problem with it is it's the fact that it's a very limited time in terms of program. It's 12 months, and it doesn't lend itself easily to conducive rapid scale up. Obviously, the humanitarian situation, we had a much different response target, different idea of how we wanted to do this. But what I would say in terms of preparedness, what we have been trying to do here is put together district profiles, whereby we've been sort of trying to show disaggregated data in affected districts before the emergencies, linked linked to floods and ongoing monsoons in this country, looking at gender, looking at age, disability, nutrition and access, and put that against the vulnerabilities and risk and be better prepared to do the targeting. And I think that's what we have to try and do. So with limited resources and cash included, we'll be able to get to those populations easily because we had pre-notified ourselves of who those vulnerable populations are and what the risks might be. Thanks.
Thanks, Jamie. I'd like to highlight to everybody that we have opened a polling that you will see in front of you on the screen on the right. This is basically, I would appreciate if you all take a few minutes and the remaining 5 minutes or so to just give us your feedback on this webinar. We really appreciate very much to hear from you what you like, what you didn't like. I also want to say that this webinar is recorded and will be available actually on our website in a few days. The same webinar will be also repeated in a few hours' time, trying to catch North America and again Middle East and Africa colleagues. So at 2:30 Geneva time, we'll be repeating live the same webinar for different audiences. So I'm just going to go very quickly to a couple of last questions if we can fit them in. And the question is back to you, Jamie. It's about the use of the private sector and the financial sector in the humanitarian response. Cash, but I think it's also broader. And William is sending the question is saying, how can we use more the private sector? Tim has already said that we're not doing it enough. So, Jamie, what are your reflections from the operation in Nepal?
Okay, thanks a lot, Panos. What I would say is that we've been trying to do work with them in terms of preparedness for earthquakes in this country beforehand. But when the emergency actually struck, we very quickly, I think within a second or third day, we pulled together a meeting of the Chambers of Commerce. And in the Chambers of Commerce, you had the key big suppliers of material, construction, otherwise, which would be appropriate for the reconstruction effort here. And at the same time, each of those, this national level of the Chambers of Commerce, they have district level Chambers of Commerce as well. And that was one of the alternative vectors for delivering assistance to affected populations. And it also gave us a sense of what those markets could accommodate and how big the supply chain was in those areas. So in that sense, that's how we worked with it. But it's not something that we have done enough with. And I think, as was mentioned by Tim, it's something we have to, especially on the issue of cash, be much more closely aligned with them. But at the same time, I think the big issue for any private sector is you have to bring something to the table. Because I think that's the only way we can do this. If we go there expecting them to give and there's nothing in it for them, we won't have them there for long. Over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Jamie. The last question actually we have just received is addressed to Tim, and it's looking at this, but I also guess the more donor community more broadly. And it says, the question is, do you see the World Humanitarian Summit as an opportunity to challenge the humanitarian coordination system? At the moment, the system is too barrier, too restricted, and in particular to multi-sector issues like cash we're discussing today. So, Tim, what are your reflections?
Well, I think you've uncovered me there, Panos. The big idea about the cash transfers is that because it's multi-sector, it does act as a natural challenge to the cluster system. Now, obviously, we're not saying that we're going to move over to 100% cash. It's not a panacea. It can't fix everything everywhere. But the panel report was delivered by the chair, Owen Barder, to the WHS Secretariat as a formal submission. And our thinking is that we can use cash to leverage some of that change potentially. So I feel that a sector approach will not disappear. And when you're talking about nutrition in particular, water, sanitation, potentially health, there are still requirements for service delivery, for still innovative but different ways of working in humanitarian, but that cash can sort of piggyback and parallel to those things to give broader outcomes as well. So yes, there's at the global consultations next week there is going to be a panel presentation around cash. And obviously there are broader discussions going on in the World Humanitarian Summit. about, you know, the system, whether the system is effective or not, and some of those discussions are unrelated to cash, but I think that there is a big question about how does a multi-sector tool fit into a very sectored system at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we have run out of time. This brings to an end to this webinar. I would really like to thank Rosie Jackson with CALP. She joined us from Oxford this morning. I'd like to thank Jamie McColdrick, Humanitarian Coordinator from Kathmandu, Rita Zakal, the Regional Head for Humanitarian Response with the Danish Church Aid, Peter Magici, who's the Regional Director for Health Aid International, also from Kathmandu, joined us, and Tim Waves with DFID, who joined this conversation from London. I'd like to particularly thank all our listeners who stayed with us throughout the conversation. We hope you found it useful. We will be downloading a recorded version of this webinar, also the presentation itself, to our webpage. We hope you found it useful. So from me, Panos Mounsis, I'd like to thank you all for staying with us this morning, and all the very best with wherever you are with the important work you're doing. So thank you and goodbye.